Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. Since 2009, the Network for Responsible Public Policy has focused on bringing timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Our monthly programs bring respected experts together to explore public policy in all its complexity. Tonight, we will focus on anti-Semitism. Much of the debate, and in some cases the violence, has occurred on college campuses. We'll begin there with a discussion featuring two experts who will examine what is happening on campuses today and explore both the myths and the realities behind these developments. We welcome tonight's panel. Vicki Katz, PhD, is a professor in the School of Communication and the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair in Free Speech at Chapman University. She is also executive director of OR Initiative, which is dedicated to developing evidence-based alternatives to how young people engage with each other over contentious and complex issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and U.S. anti-Semitism. Graham Wright, PhD, is an associate research scientist at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and an associate research professor at the Heller School for Social Policy. At the Cohen Center, he helps direct a long-running program of research exploring social divisions and prejudice, including anti-Semitism on U.S. college campuses. Tonight's moderator, Arno Rosenfeld, is an enterprise reporter at The Forward, an author of the Anti-Semitism Decoded newsletter. An award-winning investigative journalist, he has chronicled the Jewish American response to anti-Semitism, including Jewish college students confronting hostile political climates on campus, local communities grappling with white supremacist propaganda, and the deep rifts among national organizations over how to keep Jews safe. Please read their extensive bios on our website, nfrpp.org. At NFRPP, we bring credible information to our growing audience. Our speakers come prepared with reliable data, facts, research, analyses, critical thinking, and real lived experiences. We are proud that our audience represents all sides of the political spectrum. As always, we welcome your questions. NFRPP programs are designed for consideration and discussion. All comments must remain civil and non-inflammatory. Due to time constraints, not all questions may be addressed. This program is a webinar-style format. The Q&A feature is for submitting questions, and only speakers will have cameras and microphones enabled. Participants who do not adhere to these guidelines may be removed from the webinar. Thank you for your cooperation, and now let's hear what our speakers have learned. Vicki, Graham, and Arno, welcome to NFRPP. Let's get started.
Thank you, Jenny.
Great, thanks. And so, Graham, did you want to start with some kind of framing about your research, and then we'll go to Vicki, and then I can jump in with some questions?
Sounds good. So our team at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, we've been doing research about anti-Semitism on campus since as far back as 2016. So this is something we've been studying for a while. And since October 7th, we've surveyed thousands and thousands of students, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and faculty, Jewish and non-Jewish, at American universities all over the United States. And what our research has shown is that anti-Semitism is actually on campus is actually a very complex problem. It's hard to think about in monolithic terms. So, for example, right after October 7th, when we talked to Jewish students, at some of the schools we looked at, over 80% of the Jewish students we talked to said that they felt that there was hostility towards Jews on their campus. But at other schools, it was less than half of Jewish students that felt that way. So it's not all the same at every school. Our research also shows that anti-Semitism on campus, it can take many different forms. Sometimes it involves anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the media or banks or having too much power. And sometimes it involves Israel. It's situations where Jewish students are blamed for Israel's actions or they're ostracized because they say they care about what goes on in Israel, even if they're critical of the Israeli government. And Jewish students tell us that they're concerned about both of these forms of anti-Semitism on campus. Another thing that our research shows, and this is all available at our website, all this research is published there and in peer-reviewed journals. Another thing that this research tells us is that anti-Semitism is not necessarily something that pervades every aspect of the college campus. It seems like, although it's a serious problem, it's a problem that seems to be driven by relatively small groups of people. So when we surveyed non-Jewish students, we found only about 15% of non-Jewish college students, and they were mostly on the left, held views about Israel that Jewish students tended to find anti-Semitic. Another group, also around 15%, tended to hold, and these were mostly on the center and the right, tended to hold more traditional anti-Jewish prejudice, think that Jews have too much power and only care about themselves. And so both of those groups exist on campus, and Jewish students are concerned about both of them. We also found, and the Jewish students confirmed this for us, that Jewish students are more likely to encounter anti-Semitic hostility from their fellow students than from faculty. Only a tiny percent of faculty, less than 10% that we surveyed, expressed either of these kinds of anti-Semitic views. Of course, even small groups can have a big impact on campus climate, especially when they have a loud megaphone or in positions of power. But what this suggests is that fighting anti-Semitism on campus, which is something a lot of people want to do, it needs to be done with care. It may not be one problem with a single solution. It might be a set of problems that require different solutions. And what Jewish students have told us is that sometimes even well-intended actions can make things worse, can actually further inflame tensions and put them at risk. And so if we want to address anti-Semitism on campus, which we should be, it's something we should be concerned about, we want to do it in context, where we explore it in the context of other issues facing campus, other forms of prejudice, other pressures facing students and the college campus more generally.
Great, thank you. And before we go to Vicky, just a reminder to use the Q&A function really throughout this initial section. So if there's anything that Graham or Vicky say in their introductions that you're curious to hear more about, or as I get into some questions after that, we're going to probably save most of the questions until the end, but you don't need to wait to submit them. Yeah, so Vicky, do you want to share a little bit?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me for this conversation. In contrast to Graham and the wonderful team at the Cohen Center, I am not a long-standing researcher of Jewish life on campus. I'm more of an October 8th Jewish researcher. But I've been researching how technology affects young people's development, and especially how it affects their political socialization and how they relate to each other for more than 15 years. What's new for me is looking at that in specific relation to anti-Semitism and peer relations in regard to that in this post-October 7th environment. And so what I'm drawing on in this conversation is a set of studies that I've done in the past 2 years. The first of which was interview-based research with undergraduates and faculty at 20 universities across the country. And secondly, with about 65 middle and high school students and educators in 2 states, both of which have been about the post-October 7th environment on their campuses, in their social settings, on and offline, and how it's impacted Jewish and political identity development. One of the things I'm really interested in is how and which factors make a difference for when Jewish students are more and less likely to talk with their non-Jewish friends about what they're experiencing on campus, if and when they're experiencing anti-Semitism, how they feel about October 7th, the ensuing war in Gaza, and campus conditions and climate. So where Graham's work is drawing on a rich base, base of largely quantitative studies, although it's mixed methods. Mine is qualitative, with all the benefits and costs of having spoken in more depth to a smaller number of people. I've also taught a course on civil discourse for many years, and it's focused on the Middle East conflict and campus free speech and protest for the last 3 years. And so I can talk a bit about sort of the campus experience of this too. There's a few things that I wanted to kind of say as an introduction and to seed discussion beyond what Graham's already shared. One is to highlight how young people's information environments are playing a major role in how they're experiencing anti-Semitism. We know that young people are more reliant on social media than previous generations are, and that it's a major source, even if it's a passive source, of news for them. And that matters because of what they're encountering in social media. There's rampant misinformation, disinformation, decontextualized, unnuanced sorts of takes, because it's a format that's poorly suited to nuance and context. It's also a format and set of resources that tends to really magnify very extreme voices. And this connects to what Graham was saying about how this is not a large proportion of students on campus, but if they're loud on campus, they're even louder online. And that can distort what Jewish students think about the proportion of their peers that are likely to hold these kinds of views, because moderates are much less likely to post and to engage rather than just consume information. It's extremists who post and therefore look like there are far more of them than there actually are. It's also a unique information source because it doesn't just provide content, but also information about how other people are thinking about and reacting to that content. That makes social media quite different from looking at the New York Times, unless you, heaven forbid, go into the comments section, right? It's providing two layers of information at the same time. And that we found has led students to end friendships without ever talking to the person about things that, because of things they've seen that they said online or things they liked, and so forth. It also gives Jewish students insight into what's going on other campuses in a visceral way that can be pretty destabilizing. So a student who's on a relatively calm campus, or has been for the last couple of years, is still seeing in everyday detail every time they open their phone what was going on at a school like Columbia, for example, or perhaps where they have peers on other campuses where things were much more tense. And they're experiencing that in this sort of visceral way on a regular basis, in a way that brings other people's experiences much closer to their own. The other thing I'll say is that very few students described having classrooms that were counterweights to the kinds of pick a side, rush to judgment about the conflict that was so common on their social media platforms and in face-to-face settings with peers that they talked about as being social media educated about the conflict and how it relates to American life. Faculty tend to shy away from such topics in a lot of classes, and so few students had had opportunities to develop not just the skills and capabilities to debate on a shared basis of evidence or fact about the conflict or about how the conflict affects how Americans treat each other, but the few that had, in that vacuum, they either are experiencing social media in a louder way, or campus protest in a louder way, or some were experiencing specific faculty who taught about the conflict or dismissed anti-Semitism in ways that were very one-sided. And so, there's certainly much more to say, and I'm sure we'll talk about how and what anti-Semitism on campus has looked like and felt like, and what truly kind of meets different definitions. But I just wanted to seed the conversation with some of those communication dynamics that we see in our work.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. And I'll just share two sort of quick anecdotes off that because it reminded me. I've tried to, the Forward's a newspaper. I mostly write articles, but I've tried to share it with a broader audience, and I've made a few videos on TikTok that are, I think, pretty straight down the middle. I'm not trying to give a hot take. I'm just trying to summarize my reporting. And the comments, they get a decent number of views, people who watch them and don't say anything. But the people commenting, like you say, are saying like really sort of vicious things to the point where I'm like, I don't know if I want to be posting this because, as you described, right, I'm posting something, but then anyone who's watching me talk about it is probably also looking at the comments and getting just a total stream of kind of often sort of bile. So that's one piece. And then the other, and I think we'll get into some of this, but it's this question of sort of the scale of the problem on campus. And I've often experienced in reporting on college campuses exactly what you described, that I'll talk to a student and they'll say, well, things aren't that bad here, but I see my friends at other schools and they're really going through it. And then I'll talk to the students at those schools that they're describing, and they will often say that things look worse on social media than they are in reality. And so everyone's getting this sort of distilled, simplified thing that can be really scary. and distort reality a little bit. Anyway, I wanted to start by asking you both to sort of quickly, and it's a complicated and difficult thing to do, but just describe what you're referring to. You know, there are a lot of debates over how to define anti-Semitism, which we can talk about, but just for viewers on this webinar, when you refer to anti-Semitism, what are you talking about? What does that word mean in the context of your research and, you know, your work on this? Graham, we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think anti-Semitism is the way we think about it as social scientists is it's the word that for historical reasons we've decided to bestow on the prejudice that is directed against people on their basis of Jewish identity. Sexism is prejudice based on sexual identity. Racism is prejudice based on racial identity. If we had to go back in time and come up with another word for it, anti-Jewishness or something, maybe we would. But for sort of historical reasons, people started using the term anti-Semitism, and we just continue to use it to avoid confusing people. Not the only, a slight wrinkle there is sometimes it's referred to as a form of religious prejudice, and it is that, but Jewish identity is not just about religion. There's a lot of people who identify as Jewish, but don't see their religion as Judaism. They have Jewish ethnic heritage, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism is directed against people who do not consider their religion to be Jewish, and historically has been. So it's kind of a form of religious prejudice, and it's kind of a form of racial ethnic prejudice.
Right. Great. And Vicky?
I just want to underscore something that Graham said, is that in the American context, for a variety of reasons, we think of Judaism as a religion, where it would be better and more accurate to refer to it as a people who share a common culture, a common history, and for whom some, but not all, practice a religion. And so, you know, there are people who argue that really we should be calling it Judeophobia to make it more aligned with Islamophobia, that would better encompass what this actually is. And you know, but as Graham said, once we've got a term that most people understand to refer to a thing, we tend to keep using it so we don't confuse people. So what does anti-Semitism include? It's a form of discrimination that singles out people who are Jewish or identify as Jewish or of Jewish heritage on the basis of religion, history, culture. And I would argue although this is where it gets very tricky, in relation to how they identify as part of a people, and how they identify as part of a people where roughly half of those people in the world live in Israel and roughly half of those people live in the United States. We are at a position in Jewish history we've never had before, which is the diaspora beyond the US and Israel is very small, and that we're somewhat bimodal in terms of where people are located. And so the connections between those two populations are often familial, but they're also communal. And so the way that young people experience it, in my opinion, my effort in my research has always been to get to a definition that is as close to how people experience it as possible, rather than one that I'm putting on them. I would say that a lot of it is summarized well in reserving the right to vehemently disagree with half of the world's Jews without being asked to disown them. But being asked to disown Israelis because of the past 2 years or anything else is where people start feeling like criticism of Israel or of Israelis becomes anti-Semitic, where even the connection, a sense of connection or investment in Israelis and Israel becomes in itself a reason to push people away here.
And you're saying, Vicky, that many Jews feel that the demand for them to disown is encompassed within anti-Semitism. Yeah.
Yeah.
The one other thing that I want to add is, and where I think there's sometimes a distinction from other forms of prejudice, is the sort of conspiratorial thinking and, you know, blaming, the Rothschilds for controlling the world, where it's sort of like, you're not saying I don't like Jews, but you're sort of giving Jews or affording Jews a certain power that they obviously do not have. And it usually works back to pretty straightforward prejudice, but it doesn't always manifest in that way. And so sometimes I think people, don't understand, that component of it. But great. And Vicky, you started to get at this, and feel free to share more. But I also wanted to go back to Graham and ask, about how you think about drawing that line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, acknowledging that there's a ton of, debate over this. I don't think there's a single consensus view, but, as a researcher who has to go and try to quantify these things in some way, how do you do that in your research? And then, personally, sort of what do you think the right way to do that is?
Yeah. So this is a really tough question. It's very contentious. I want to just start by acknowledging this question is not unique to anti-Semitism, about how you draw the line around or how you define a particular form of prejudice. So, for example, think about anti-Black racism. For years, there was a sort of minimal definition of that you were a racist if you explicitly thought that Black people were biologically inferior and should be kept out of bathrooms and things like that. And then over time, scholars of race and racism of America have argued that that's too narrow of a way of understanding racism, and that you can think about there's attitudes and structures and policies that may not even explicitly refer to race, but could have racist effects, or there could be implicit racial bias, even if the person doesn't think that they're racist. And obviously, and this leads to a lot of very contentious ideas right now, thinking about critical race theory and things like that. And those have been very controversial. But there's a lot of people who think that they're useful as well. And now with anti-Semitism, we're having a similar sort of debate. Do you consider something anti-Semitic if it's the person thinks that I think that Jews are bad in some way, or involve some conspiracy, or have some belief about Jews in particular? And over the past decades, scholars of American Jews, or of Jews around the world, of anti-Semitism, have made various arguments that, given the history of anti-Semitism, such as the fact that Israel was established after the Holocaust as a refuge for Jews, given that, as Vicky said, half of them live there, given that many Jews identify emotionally with Israel, even if they are critical of what its government's doing, because of all that stuff, there's a bunch of reasons why certain attitudes or statements or beliefs or practices involving Israel or its supporters might be anti-Semitic in effect, even if they don't involve the word Jews in them. Now, of course, the ideological actors in this fight are often reversed. Some of the same people who are saying we should have a more narrow definition of racism are saying we should have a more expansive definition of anti-Semitism, and vice versa. But from us so this is a tough problem, and for us as social scientists, what we're doing is, we're trying to study a social problem on campus. And the phenomenon that we're studying is that a bunch of Jewish students tell us, I've experienced anti-Semitism in various forms, and it's related to Israel in some way. And so what we do is we ask them, like, well, what do you mean by that? When you say you're experiencing anti-Semitism related to Israel, what do you mean by that? What sorts of beliefs about Israel do you think are anti-Semitic, and which ones aren't? And when we do this research and surveys and interviews, what we generally find is what they really think is anti-Semitic is it's not when their peers criticize Israel, because they do that too often. It's when their peers don't think Israel should exist at all in its current form as a Jewish state, and when they hold that belief so strongly that they wouldn't want to interact or even be friends or have any contact with anybody who does believe that Israel should exist in its current form as a Jewish state. And that combination of views, even though it's not explicitly views about Jews, it effectively bars people who hold those views from being friends with most of the Jews on their campus in most cases. So, and that distinction is actually also echoed in a lot of the formal definitions of anti-Semitism. It makes that same distinction, not criticizing Israel, but arguing, but statements about its existence and its supporters. And so when we try to measure anti-Semitic attitudes among non-Jews, the views we sort of include in that analysis are these sorts of views that the Jewish students we survey think are anti-Semitic. This isn't perfect, and it's a definition that depends on a moving target about how Jews think about Israel and anti-Semitism in a given context and a given time, but it's what we've generally used.
And it's an interesting point that you raise at the end there, and something that I've often struggled to articulate, because it almost sounds like you're describing the combination of a belief and an action. So it's not someone sitting, in a polite discussion, like maybe the type of civil discourse space that Vicky, you're trying to sort of encourage, and saying, look, for a variety of reasons, I think the best solution to the conflict might be a binational state or some sort of confederation as opposed to the exact current political structure in Israel. Here's why I think that, what do you think? It's more saying, I think that a Jewish state in Israel is evil and, equivalent to Nazi Germany. And so if you disagree with me, then you're a Nazi and, you're not welcome in various social spaces. And I think that's part of the reason it's hard to define, right? Is because it's not just something you can write down on a piece of paper. It's like carried out and lived in the world. But anyway, I digress a bit. Vicky, does that sort of, does what Graham described resonate with you? How do you think about that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with both of you have said, and I think, there's a difference between sort of a formal definition and how it feels and how it's lived. Because I think what you're both pointing to, and I'll just underscore it, is really feelings of contempt, right, for somebody who holds a different view on this than you do. And it is interesting to watch students kind of roll over in their minds for the first time in a classroom, which is really the place where you can ask students to do that, why they cannot think of another country where there is still a debate over its, quote, right to exist, end quote. No country, not South Sudan, which is less than a decade old, not the Czech Republic, which is about 32 years old, right? Why are we still litigating the legitimacy of a country that's almost 80 years old? And none of them can think of another country where we're still doing that. The idea of Israel's right to exist, right? You have a right to exist if you can defend your existence. I mean, Israel is a reality. You can criticize its relationship with Palestine and its other neighbors. Certainly, that is not anti-Semitic. But treating Israel in a way that is completely extraordinary and different from and suspect in a sort of sinister way, right? And that is really often how those discussions get felt for students. One of the students that we spoke to pointed out, rightly, I think, that he has friends on campus who are of Russian descent. And nobody thinks it is strange or sinister that he has family in Russia in this war that he's worried about. And yet they feel hesitant to say that they are worried about Israeli family who are, in danger amidst a war. That we don't have these same sorts of hesitations with other countries. And so the sense of contempt, I think, is important. And the sense of distancing, that you won't even have the conversation about what potential solutions would be that take people who, support the existence of Jewish self-determination seriously, is something that students really, and faculty, Jewish faculty, also kind of really struggle with. We can talk, and I hope we will talk about the way that "Are you a Zionist?" as a kind of opening question gets used on college campuses as a way to sort of ferret out people's politics, but also their identity, and questions that are really only asked of students who, quote unquote, sound Jewish or look Jewish, or because I think that's part of this as well, is the slippage between Zionist and Jewish.
Yeah, and I think that brought up a couple things in my mind, because I think that you're absolutely right, of course, that the intensity of this is so much stronger around Israel. And, I've been tracking a little bit. Other countries have tried to adopt similar frameworks. So during the war, following the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian embassy in various countries started trying to promote this idea of Russophobia. So this idea that if you spoke out against Russian support for the invasion, that you were actually engaged in a form of bigotry. And there's also a very complicated conversation around Hindu phobia in relation to India and Hindu nationalism, and where the line is between discriminating against people who believe in that based on their shared ancestry and political speech. So it's not solely on Israel that we see this, but certainly as like a live debate on college campuses, I understand that the intensity is really unmatched.
The question I would ask in relation to that is, and I pose this to students and so forth, it is strange, or should be strange, to Americans that every time anything happens in the Middle East, every Jewish institution goes on high alert immediately. The same is true for many mosques and Muslim institutions, right? That something happening half a world away changes the way that Americans have to go about their daily lives, their religious practice, putting their kids in school and so forth. To my knowledge, and I've looked, Russian and Ukrainian churches have not been, heightened targets in the last 4 years. And so, the idea of, sort of Russophobia being something that's sort of akin to or in alignment with, I would have questions about that as a lived experience vis-a-vis what kind of relationship that we're talking about between geopolitical conflict half a world away and how Americans live as a result.
Sure, absolutely. And the one other thing I just want to name, and it may come up in some of these other questions, but it doesn't always, and I think it's just worth flagging, is the diversity within the Jewish community, to the extent that there is such a thing as a Jewish community. But on campuses, I think we have seen that somewhere around, there are different polls, but around 20% perhaps of the Jewish student body. I think this was from some of Eitan Hirsch at Tufts research. Around 20% of Jewish students on campus say that they don't support a Jewish state in Israel. So that's obviously a minority, but at a lot of these protests and encampments, you do see a pretty large Jewish student representation. And that's something that can kind of get lost when we're talking about the experience of the bulk of Jewish students who are typically not on the front lines of either side of this conflict and are just sort of trying to live their lives on campus. But I don't want that to get totally lost. And maybe to try to ground this in some kind of specificity, Vicky, can you talk about what anti-Semitism looks like on campus? So you've alluded to it a little bit, and we have some of the numbers about, maybe 30% of students express opinions that many Jewish students find anti-Semitic. But how does that actually manifest? Presumably all of the people who hold those opinions are not actively engaging in, perhaps they are, but engaging in anti-Semitism. But what are you seeing when you talk to Jewish students? What are their lived experiences in relation to these issues?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that comes up over and over again, and not just in my research, there was a wonderful article in the New York Times about Zionism being used as a social litmus test on college campuses that really reflected in the work that I've done. That trying to join the campus gardening club, for example, things that should have absolutely nothing to do with politics or identity. And I'm not picking that randomly. A gardening club was actually one of the places we heard this. If you've got a name that sounds Jewish, or you're wearing a Jewish star, or you look Jewish in some cases, the first question you'll be asked is, are you a Zionist? They were seeing this even on dating sites, right? That people with Jewish last names, the first question they're being asked is, are you a Zionist? That might not be something that's anti-Semitic in intent, right? It's meant to ferret out potentially a particular form of politics, but it is anti-Semitic in its effect. Right. If you are only asking these questions of people who look or sound or appear to be Jewish, and excluding them as a result of the answer, you are treating them differently and you are ostracizing them. And that is something that I've heard in various forms again and again, and at the campuses where we've done interviews. And that is one of those subtle sort of social dynamics that would be very hard for school administrators to ferret out or do much about, but it is pretty powerful stuff. I have enormous respect for Eitan's research, and I think he's foregrounded some of the dynamics of what's going on campuses that are really unique and how they cluster together. That 20% is higher, even though we see more of those sorts of sentiments amongst Jews in the younger generation than we do in older ones, right? Anti-Israel sorts of sentiments, however that's being defined in a particular study. But 20% is higher than we see more generally. And I think that some of that is that at this point, there is sort of a general sense of, the sort of firestorm around the war in Gaza and so forth that we've seen in the last few years seems to have sort of receded on campuses to a large extent because of the ceasefire, however imperfectly held it might be right now, because most, all but one of the hostages is home and so forth. It has receded to some degree. But my guess would be that, especially if being asked in a survey, because different methods produce different results, you would get a higher number of students than you would in interviews saying that they don't support Israel being a Jewish state because it is more socially acceptable in many quarters, especially if you are politically left of center, to say that now. And the vast majority of American Jews, even now, do define themselves as being left of center. So I think there are these kinds of social litmus tests. The way that the word Zionist is being used is fascinating. Just as an anecdote, because we talk about the difference between labels and definitions in the civil discourse class. I always ask, what proportion of American Jews the students think would define themselves as a Zionist or by the definition of being a Zionist, even if they wouldn't use that label. And I always think of a very bright student who very earnestly said she's sure it isn't more than 4%. And she was trying very hard to, sort of give Jews the benefit of the doubt. Why would they associate themselves with something like that? And it took us quite a while to get up to the sort of generally accepted proportions of American Jews who, at least, even if they wouldn't use the label, do believe in Jewish self-determination somewhere within what is, that piece of territory within that region. And when they hear the definition, they realize that the way that Zionist is being used in social media and in the conversations they have on campus is quite different from that definition, although of course there are many of them, but that is the most generally sort of accepted one. So I think a lot of the ways that this is manifesting on campus, sometimes it's things that are written in chalk that are hard to, define, something like death to Israel being chalked on a campus. Do you mean Israel as a state, or do you mean the people of Israel? Because those two things could be read in that statement. And one of them is anti-Semitic. The other one, I would say, is a questionable choice, but might not be. And that's where these lines are very difficult to draw. The idea that any criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic is obviously problematic in terms of, conventions of free speech that we hold to be, deeply important on campus and in other places. So I'd say a lot of it is not quite so in your face. It's not the swastikas chalked in front of a Jewish fraternity and so forth. Those are easier. Those lines are harder to draw. They're deeply felt, but they're harder for most young people to articulate in a really clear way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I talk a lot about or I try to use terminology around sort of social alienation
Yeah.
in terms of
Yes.
because I think, when we sent out the promotion for this event to the forward list, a reader wrote in and said, because it mentions violence and I think even I don't know if it said murder, but in the, and they said, have there been anti-Semitic murders on campus? And the answer, thankfully, is no. There have been assaults of various kinds and
I
both
can.
traditional assaults and also like pushing and shoving and different physical things. There's also sometimes it's a little porous, like at Columbia, for example, what's happening near campus, who's a student, is there not,
Yes.
et cetera. But yeah, Graham, I don't know if you want to comment on like, is there stuff that's going beyond interpersonal stuff when
Yeah. So when we, as you said, we ask about if you've experienced physical attacks, and almost no students say yes. And sometimes they do sometimes report harassment. It's more common on social media than in person. But again, I would say the bulk of the most the thing, and they report seeing graffiti and things like that they perceive as offensive. I agree with Vicky that the sort of most problematic and also most harmful manifestation of this for most Jewish students is a social alienation. And sometimes it doesn't have to come up with words at all. It's just for a Jewish student, their non-Jewish friends just distance themselves after October 7th. There may not be words spoken about it at all. This is what the Jewish students will sometimes say.
I'll just jump in with
Sure,
something
please.
while Graham's sorting that out. I think that the social alienation is definitely deeply felt. I also think there's an interesting thing with how university leaders because some of these things about chalking and feeling quote unquote unsafe, right, on college campuses that have spent um, a decade or more, touting that, they've created safe spaces for students with particular minority identities, was really Jewish students feeling like, well, everybody gets a safe space except us, right? We're the only ones who have to walk past graffiti like this. We've stood up, not that it's a transactional experience, but we've marched for Black Lives Matter. We've marched for all of these other rights and groups. And suddenly after October 7th, no one's got a thing to say to us, right? Our pain, our experience is simply, not worth hearing about. And I think part of the reason that university leaders have struggled with this is that generally when there is a conflict around a politically polarizing issue, sometimes only one of those groups is really prominent on campus, right? When we talk about Black Lives Matter with regard to police reform, there are, very few members of law enforcement or their immediate families who are on college campuses just because of, social class dynamics. There's less of sort of a dialogue between those two groups. Black Lives Matter and those perspectives felt totally ubiquitous on college campuses. It didn't feel like a conflict between, different perspectives. It might have been in the broader society, but it didn't feel like that on college campuses. It felt like there was sort of one right view. And generally, beyond that, when campus leaders have to make decisions about two groups of students on campus, for example, gendered spaces, women's spaces on campus, and the rights of trans students, there's one group that's much larger and one group that's much smaller, even if both have been sort of historically marginalized in some way, and it's easier to side with a smaller number of students. In a post-October 7th world, or when there's any kind of conflict in the Middle East that then foments on college campuses, because this has been more than it's been in previous times, but this is not the first time that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has become a major factor on college campuses. You have a unique set of factors where you have two groups of students or their supporters who are both small numbers on college campuses, right? Jews are maybe 2-ish% of the general population, Muslim Americans even less. So you've got two small groups on campus that are directly connected in some way, and their supporters who are activated. So you can't break a tie on population size. But they're both very active and present on campus, right? It's not a case where there's more of one voice versus another. So you have two smaller numbers of students who are deeply and actively engaged. And a lot of university leaders just really aren't sure what to do to break a tie on how they're supposed to behave in a circumstance like that. It is fairly unique in that way.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the really interesting things about this idea of, and I think Graham, you mentioned the inversion of some of the way these things are normally talked about, that progressive, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but just to make the point, progressives who often care a lot about this concept of microaggressions, things that are not the worst manifestation of racism or hate, but that we sort of have recognized in recent years as not okay, as not things that we want to encourage in society or on campus, tend to diminish what you might consider to be anti-Semitic microaggressions. And on the flip side, the people who spent years mocking microaggressions on the right are suddenly very concerned about, microaggressions that Jewish students might experience. And then these things, of course, reinforce each other because they get sort of subsumed by our partisan politics. One of the things that I think has been interesting over the past, to some extent, this was true under Biden, but certainly under Trump, with a lot of pressure on university administrators to address anti-Semitism in one form or another. We've seen an interesting phenomenon. Harvard had this in there when they released their dual reports, one on anti-Semitism and one on anti-Muslim, Arab, Palestinian discrimination. They found that students who had sort of a personal tie to Israel or were Jewish tended to feel like they were facing discrimination from their peers. And students with the tie to the other side of the conflict, who, we could think about as Palestine, felt like they were pretty fine with their peers, but that they were facing discrimination from the administration. And that brings me to a question for you, Vicky, about social media, which is, I think there's been this idea, and certainly a lot of the way that the Jewish community has responded to anti-Semitism on campus has been with these legalistic approaches. And, starting from the correct standpoint that universities are required to provide equal opportunity to learn, and that if they're failing Jewish students or some Jewish students in that way around anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, they need to remedy that. But I'm thinking a little bit about your example about the Zionist litmus test, because we've seen a few schools essentially ban that and say, you're not allowed to discriminate against somebody on the basis of whether they're a Zionist, whatever that means. But that doesn't necessarily change hearts and minds, right? You could ban a club from asking that in the application, but like people can still post on their Instagram story stuff about how Zionists are evil, and they can still give you dirty looks if they think you're a Zionist. So when it comes to social media, especially, to what extent is that something that schools can or should regulate? And if it's beyond the realm of that, what works to, how do we get to a space where Jewish students don't feel isolated every time they open up their phones and see what their peers are posting?
If I had the answer to that, I'd have implemented it. Um, the simple answer is I don't think there is a way for universities to monitor those things, and frankly, I don't think they should. I don't think this is within the realm of what universities should be doing. If what students are posting online crosses a line where they are directly threatening a student or doxing, that's a different story, and we've certainly seen examples of that, right? If they are posting the private information of Jewish students and encouraging people to, do harm, then you've crossed a line, and that is something that most universities have been pretty swift about taking action on, and they should. But yeah, this is the troublesome situation I think in which we find ourselves, which is that for 2 years and frankly more, because anti-Semitism on college campuses or a particular or teaching about the conflict in Israel from only a single viewpoint that's more of a settler colonial perspective, when there are certainly many historical nuances that get left out, if I'm being polite, by teaching in just that way. That all of that predates October 7th and is part of explaining how something could erupt so quickly that by October 8th we were seeing what we were. You're not the calls for the last 2 years of campuses need to do something about anti-Semitism. I think a lot of American Jews, and it's not just, I mean, the surveys show a lot of American Jews who felt like something needed to be done are also now saying in surveys, no, but not this, right? That they didn't want federal, sort of crackdowns coming as the way that universities were going to change this, because there's certainly fears, and it's represented in a variety of surveys and research that's been done recently, fears that this is actually going to make anti-Semitism worse, because of the backlash to this sort of heavy-handed enforcement. So I don't think social media can or should be regulated. I do think we have to think, as Graham said right at the top of this discussion, about what the particular intervention should be that is capable of opening up conversations between students and between parts of a campus community that make it more likely that even if you are not changing hearts and minds, that you will at the very least open people up to the idea that people who see and understand these issues differently from them are not inherently immoral or wrong, and worth casting out of social situations. At least being able to take each other seriously is a good start.
Right, right. That makes sense. Great. And okay, Graham, let's try to bring you back in, and maybe if you want to try it with your camera off and just audio, we can do that.
Give it a
But
shot.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, one of the interesting things that I've found from both, the Brandeis research and elsewhere is what you've talked about the left and the right, and that students on the right are more likely to express what you might consider sort of clear or traditional anti-Semitism than students on the left, even though most of this alienation that we're talking about is in relation to the sort of progressive student position on Israel. And so can you share a little bit more about what you've learned about the partisan split or difference here, and some ways of thinking about that? Like, what do we do with the fact that, you have right-wing students holding anti-Semitic views that don't seem to be factoring in as much, and the left-wing students maybe don't think that they're anti-Semitic, but perhaps, as Vicky's mentioned, the impact is coming back on Jewish students. So yeah, what are you seeing in terms of the political breakdown here?
Sure. So, I mean, one thing to mention first off, and you alluded to this before, is that anti-Semitism is a sort of uniquely flexible prejudice, that it's based on this. It's not based on, as you said, the idea that this group is inferior, like anti-Black prejudice, but that they're actually they it imbues Jews with power. It says that they're running the world secretly. And the flexible part is that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory can argue that the Jews are the enemy of whatever it is you don't like. So for people on the right, Jews are blamed for communism and immigration, but Jews can also be blamed for capitalism as the masters of banks and Wall Street. And so that's why you've had a history going back to Marx and Hitler about anti-Semitism from different sides. But right now, a big part of liberal and progressive identity is a rejection of religious and racial stereotypes. People on the left don't want to think of themselves as prejudiced, especially towards groups perceived to be marginalized, and that includes Jews. And so if you ask people on the left if they think anything negative about Jews, they almost always say no. If you ask people on the center or the right, they are more likely to agree with statements that explicitly talk about Jews. But as we've talked and as Vicky's given examples, you can still have people on the left who they don't consider themselves anti-Semitic, but for the reasons that we suggested, they can take actions or express beliefs that end up producing these effects on their Jewish peers that are perceived to be anti-Semitic. And the question is, so these are two, but they don't consider themselves anti-Semitic. And so this is why we said that these are two different groups, and you wouldn't expect, if there was some intervention that could address anti-Semitism, you wouldn't expect it to be the same intervention to both of these groups. That whatever you do to try to convince people who think that Jews as a people are have some undesirable characteristic, you wouldn't expect that also to work on people who deeply believe that they are not anti-Semitic, but also that they wouldn't want to be friends with anyone who thinks of themselves as a Zionist or cares about what their friends or family in Israel are doing. And so I think this goes back to my point about anti-Semitism. Addressing anti-Semitism on campus needs to be done with care, and you want to target these efforts very carefully, and not assume that there's one sort of problem that's driving the whole issue everywhere.
Right. And I also am just curious, we're coming to the end of the list of questions I have, and then there are some good ones in the chat that I want to get to. But I want to ask both of you, in your research, where are you sort of finding Jewish students? Sorry, my computer's going off. Because, I know there's a lot of polling done of Jews, but it's also hard to find. I mean, there just aren't that many. So if you just start calling random numbers, you aren't going to find that many Jews, and there are different ways of measuring them. When I go to a campus to report, I'm typically relying on Jewish institutions and clubs, people who have sort of raised their hand and said, like, hey, I'm Jewish, I'm doing something. But of course, that's missing a lot of Jewish students who are keeping their heads down or who just don't, it's not the
Sure.
main part of their identity. So when you talk about and when you poll Jews, who are they? Who's the subsection that you're reaching? Are there people that you're not capturing in your research? Open to both of you.
Sure. I think that's it's very important. I mean, you can't talk to everybody, so who you talk to has to be both chosen very carefully, but also you have to be very clear about who you didn't reach. So the research that we did on college campuses, we were explicitly targeting students who identified themselves in any way as left of center, because we wanted to look at students who were more likely to have seen their political identities, their social connections disrupted in some way by October 7th. And students on the right were much less likely to have experienced that than those on the left were. We explicitly looked for connections to students who were not actively involved before October 7th with Jewish campus life. I didn't want the students who went to Hillel every Friday night and went to every event that Hillel and Chabad hosted. I was looking for the students who were most likely to be able to talk about how their lives had shifted politically and Jewishly in the months since October 7th, like the months between October 7th and when we were speaking to them. And because it's an interview-based, a qualitative study, we relied I relied on networks of faculty that I knew at different campuses. I relied on people that I knew and friends of theirs to reach out with a short blurb of, would you be willing to spend X amount of time on Zoom talking about these things with me? And so I think that is, it's one of the difficulties. I understand why people tend to go through Jewish campus organizations to find students who are Jewish. But you do end up with a particular kind of Jewish student in that way. And so the interview sort of subset that we spoke with included students who were had one Jewish parent, had two Jewish parents who were raised everything from culturally Jewish but not practicing to modern Orthodox. Students who were Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or some combination of that, and also students whose political views and views on Israel ranged everything from, as they called it, a Biden Democrat at the time, to capital L leftist, and everything from non-Zionist or anti-Zionist to, being interviewed with a flag of Israel behind them on Zoom. So, as Arna, as you were saying before, the idea of a Jewish community being a monolith is it's an unruly bunch to quantify for sure. And if I can say one thing before turning it over to Graham, I think the felt difference for students that we've spoken with between anti-Semitism from the right and from the left, and this really aligns with what Graham was talking about quantitatively, is that people on the right who hold anti-Semitic views tend to hold it of Jews absolutely as a monolith. Jewish students experience anti-Semitism from the left as being divided by what kind of Jew you are. Good Jews are anti-Zionist Jews. Bad Jews, or even if they wouldn't call it that, are Zionist Jews or Jews who in some way don't align fully with progressive leftist politics. And so there's more of a divergence of what groups you might fall into. And so, when people are progressive, student groups are surveyed and hold less sort of monolithically anti-Semitic views, it's because they're thinking of the Jewish students who are in the encampments who are anti-Zionist, but they don't associate with any of the majority of Jews who are not in the encampments with them, which is something that students on the right probably wouldn't associate with Jews of any stripe.
Great. Graham?
Yeah, so as I said, we've done quite a number of studies of Jews and non-Jews on campus. And so there's not just one answer to this. The surveys that we did right after October 7th were largely of Jewish students who had applied to this program, Birthright Israel, that young Jews can apply to have a trip to Israel. And the sample for that was people who applied to the program. They didn't necessarily go, and they all applied before October 7th. So before going to Israel was sort of more politically contentious. After that, we did a follow-up study with an organization called College Pulse, which is it just surveys college students in general, and we targeted that sample at schools where there are large Jewish populations, to the best of our knowledge. And so we got quite a number of Jews in that sample too. When we did a survey of faculty, we used another commercial data source that has information on faculty, and including Jewish faculty. And so we don't just we have lots of different kinds of Jews, and including Jews who have no prior connection to Israel or anything like that. With one of our other studies, one of the things that we're working on now is yet another study that uses a different data vendor that surveys college students, that will allow us to get a big sample of Jews, but also non-Jews. And so we're always collecting new data on different using different sources so that we're not subject to the biases of any one source, and we're looking at how those different data sources work together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you both for explaining. And I just sort of, for the audience, I will say I think that, the academic research on campus anti-Semitism is really thoughtful about the way that it, tries to identify and talk to Jewish students in a way that, advocacy organizations that release their own polling, which is probably a majority of the polling just because there's a lot of it, it is not. And that's not always for nefarious reasons. It's just hard to do. It takes a long time to do the more rigorous methodology that you're both using, but I think it yields, really, really great data. So that's great. Well, I'll just ask one final question, and then I'll move to the audience questions. But I'd love to hear from both of you about kind of contextualizing anti-Semitism in relation to what else we're seeing on campus. I mean, often it's really siloed as its own issue, campus anti-Semitism. Vicky, your work obviously touches on civil discourse. I assume there are other forms of uncivil discourse, even if they may look different. So I guess, and you've spoken both to some of this, so no need to go over all of that again, but what makes campus anti-Semitism perhaps stand apart from other forms of prejudice that we might see on campus, and where does it overlap? And then by the same token, when we look at potential solutions or effective interventions, are there some interventions that we need for just campus anti-Semitism, or are we really talking about things that are going to address everything on campus and as a result benefit Jews and help reduce anti-Semitism? So packed a lot in there, but how does this, I guess, compare to other things, and what are the solutions? Yeah.
I think, there are ways in which anti-Semitism gets treated by others as if it's different from other forms of bigotry. We've talked about some of that, over the last hour, that anti-Semitism by groups on the left gets treated as if it is something to be dismissed. It is not talked about alongside, racism, sexism, etc. It is talked about or treated differently for all the reasons that we've talked about. It's also being treated differently from a governmental sort of top-down level in the way that it's being dealt with, especially this kind of push to combat campus anti-Semitism happening alongside the dismantling of DEI, right? So we're seeing it being treated as separate and apart, and sort of being alienated from, it's not just students that are feeling a sense of social alienation. The actual issue and what to do about it is getting treated in a way that alienates it from other issues, both sort of within universities, but also in terms of federal treatment. It's being treated as something separate and distinct. I think in many ways that's part of the problem of how to treat and manage it, right? When we treated issues around other forms of discrimination or historical marginalization came to be put under an umbrella of DEI, we've seen a backlash to how it was kind of formulated on campuses, and sort of as having, quote unquote, gone too far in many people's estimations and now being pulled back. And there's been some excellent reporting and commentary. I remember reading a few pieces in The Atlantic about it. The fear that in 5 years, anti-Semitism efforts will be talked about and treated in the same way as having gone too far, and that we've got to pull them back. And so, I think it gets treated as if it is something different. In some ways, perhaps it is, but in many ways, any form of sort of social distinction that leads to one group of students having a qualitatively different college experience from their peers and feeling like there are ways in which they cannot cross certain barriers, and there are so many things about themselves they cannot share, is problematic regardless of which small group of students we're talking about, but very, very tricky to figure out how to do that in a way that feels like it's coming from young people and isn't heavy-handed. I think there are ways to do that, but a lot of it needs to be prompted and come from below, and then be met with response from, senior administration.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've certainly observed that, like, some of the heavy-handed approach gets people to, I mean, maybe it's an excuse, but the people sort of write off legitimate concerns because they say, oh, well, you're saying, and there are people, right, who define a very broad array of things that we might not think of as anti-Semitic as anti-Semitism. So people look at those broadest possible examples and then use that to dismiss everything. And it's, sort of this toxic cycle. Graham, do you want to chime in on this? I also have another question
Sure.
from the audience for you, but yeah, let's start
Yeah,
with you.
I definitely think you really need to study anti-Semitism in the context of these other forms of prejudice. That is the number one subject of our current study that is not out yet. Um, and Jewish students are expressing these challenges on campus, and Black and Muslim students are expressing other concerns, and um, being able to address just one of them and not the other is going to get administrators into trouble with various groups of students. I think one of the things that we can, as Vicky alluded to, the connection between anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice is often contested, with people saying that a lot of the people who have attacked efforts to address other forms of prejudice are advocating more efforts to address anti-Semitism. But one of the things we can do is deploy some of what we know about what works and what doesn't in regard to addressing other forms of prejudice. There is research about how mandatory diversity training often doesn't work when you're trying to reduce other forms of prejudice, that it sometimes produces backfire effects. No one's really done any high quality research about anti-Semitism fighting programs on campus, but you would imagine that that probably applies as well in that context. One of the things that other research on other forms of prejudice suggests is one strategy that does work is bringing people of different groups together in a situation where they're working towards a shared goal in a respectful way, and that experience can often cause them to reassess their prejudices. That might work for anti-Semitism too. So one of the areas where we can bring what we know about what's worked well and poorly in addressing other forms of prejudice, and we wouldn't expect them to work exactly the same with anti-Semitism. It is distinct in a lot of different ways, but it's a starting point in terms of designing efforts to address it. And it's something that I think there's a lot of money and effort being spent on trying to address anti-Semitism on campus, but very little of it is based on prior knowledge about what has worked and not in regard to other forms of prejudice, and very little of it has been subject to rigorous evaluation.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Well, I want to move to an audience question about faculty, and maybe I'll combine it with one about the application. The wording was has the application of colonialism and associated language inflamed anti-Semitism? Vicky, I think you alluded to that, but maybe Graham, because I believe you've researched this specifically. So the question from the audience was faculty unions and organizations that focus on Israel and support protests that shade into hostility toward Jewish students seem to suggest a much larger scale faculty involvement in anti-Jewish hostility than the speakers describe. Could you comment? So can you share what you've learned about, anti-Semitic views among faculty? One, and then two, maybe Vicky, could you share, what you've seen in terms of curriculum and the way that some of these issues are taught, whether or not that's explicitly anti-Semitic, but the impact it has. So starting with you, Graham.
Sure. So I think one of the things that I think I said at the beginning is small groups of people can have big effects. And so when we do what's basically get a representative sample of all faculty and ask them if they agree with any of these views, we find only about 3% of these faculty will admit to holding views about Israel that Jewish students think are anti-Semitic. This is stuff like, I wouldn't want to collaborate with a scholar who supports the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. It's a very small percentage of faculty agree with those sorts of statements. About 7% agree with the more traditional forms of anti-Semitism, about Jews in America have too much power and don't care about anyone but themselves. So it does seem like it's a very small group, but that small group is concentrated. It's concentrated in certain kinds of schools, in certain kinds of disciplines, and often it's the people with the most extreme views who are often in leadership positions in academic organizations, and they often have large influence within their they can have large influence within their fields. So even if these attitudes are not held by a large number of faculty, the faculty who do hold them can often wield substantial power and cause issues for some students. So it's people often want to equate the size of the problem with the percentage of people who are the cause of the problem, and that's not necessarily the case. Most of the faculty, when we ask them about Israel and how often they've taught about Israel, and if they've taught about Israel, how they would teach about it. And most faculty are very unlikely to say that they've taught about Israel in any capacity at all. But when they do, they say that they want to teach from both sides, and they want to let students make up their own mind. And but that's most of them, but not all of them. And sometimes it's the ones who are the most likely to teach courses specifically about Israel that might have the most extreme views on it.
And Graham, just to clarify, so you're saying that more faculty were willing to express views opposed to like Jews as Jews
Yes.
than toward Israel. Yeah, that's
Now, I will clarify this. This
This
survey was done after the 2024 election. So this is in the context of President Trump's actions towards universities. And so make of that what you will. But yes, but we did find that.
Yeah, interesting. Great. Well, thank you. Vicky, do you want to talk about sort of what we're seeing in the classroom?
Yeah. So there's a few things to say. I think just to underscore what Graham said, it's a small proportion of faculty that teach about Israel or about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Part of that is because so many faculty feel like it's all risk and no reward because of the small number of very committed, very vocal colleagues that they have who will pay a social cost for talking about or teaching about these things in more nuanced ways. I asked that the hosts share with all of you a study that was done recently by some colleagues at Claremont McKenna College in California, where they looked at syllabi for how certain contested topics are taught to see if topics, I think it included the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, abortion, and it suddenly escapes me what the third one was, but how often certain perspectives are on the syllabus and whether or not there's another source that's assigned right after it that would show the other view. And Edward Said's settler colonialism view of the Middle East is assigned far and away more than anything else, and it is almost never, like under 5% of the time, is it taught next to a source that takes a view of Israelis also being an indigenous, people on the land, not rather than being colonialists who are coming from somewhere and have another homeland they could go back to, which is the definition of being a colonialist. And so, where these topics are being taught in the classroom, they're not being taught as often as they could be, because it's a very interesting case. It's a very interesting example. I mean, when I teach about the conflict, it is as an example of one of the things that is hardest to have civil discourse about. It's like a really high watermark. I say to them, if we can, by the end of the semester, you can get to a point where you can have an effective, evidence-based, multi-sided conversation about this topic. Talking about abortion after that looks pretty straightforward, right? And that's part of how I tell them, kind of why we're doing this, and that it's part of helping them see how what they're seeing in their feeds is far from the whole story. But it becomes a case then of something you are trying to teach otherwise. Israel's often not taught in that way, and in some ways it's strange that it isn't, because it is in many ways has so many parallels to the United States. It's a country where you have people who have come from so many places to form a country. They have issues around the balance between democracy and security, and how different minority groups are treated within a system. There's a lot of questions around, sort of civic responsibility and so forth, and the role of government in people's lives. it's an interesting case for all sorts of things you could be teaching in sort of comparative government classes and so forth, but it's very seldom treated as an interesting case. It is always something that's freighted with additional meaning. Another thing I will say, and I think it's very important in terms of the sort of academic climate around talking about Israel, has been the push of so many scholarly associations in the last 2 years, also previously, but really in the last 2 years, to sign on to statements of the entire association, either condemning Israel in the post-October 7th environment or signing on to boycott, divest, and sanction sorts of efforts where they're not willing to allow Israeli academics to be part of these associations anymore, that they commit that they're not going to collaborate with or work with academics from these institutions and so forth, moves that are fundamentally illiberal, right? Because anyone who's paying attention would know the Israelis who are most likely to oppose their government's actions are those on the left, and academics are disproportionately on the left. We have not seen calls for similar sorts of efforts to exclude all academics from a particular place around, the Russia-Ukraine war. We have not seen it around Chinese scholars. There's Iranian scholars. We don't see it anywhere else, but we see it with this. Actually, if the audience wants to take a look at this, the American Historical Association this weekend became one of the groups that has successfully turned down doing one of these moves. But that's been unusual. The American Anthropological Association was out the gate early with one of these. There's been a variety of them, and when a scholarly association takes a position on a singular conflict that there's only one way to see it, it stifles debate, deliberation, and scholarly activity around that issue that really should be open. That's really the point of a scholarly association. So it's not an enormous number of people who hold these views, but those who do are very singularly minded. They're very disciplined. They're very focused. And this has really been their goal for many, many years, is to make this treatment of this issue, this sort of, very one-dimensional view, the way that these things are treated within the academy and within academic discussion.
Yeah, the cost benefit thing you mentioned is interesting because I think that it's similar, right, a little bit then to social media where it's the moderates don't really want to weigh in. So a professor who might not be an ideologue on the conflict, what's the incentive for them to devote one class? Maybe they teach a class about water resources and want to talk about, coexistence and water rights. And it's like, what is there's a risk, right, that somebody's going to record what you say and try to cancel you in one way or another, or get some nonprofit to try to get the government to sue. It's very fraught. And so then that really leaves the people who are the most committed and who've decided to dedicate themselves to this and in the academy, I guess.
And it can honestly be much closer to home and lower stakes than that, which is that they will have a colleague who will, treat them rudely because they seem to be taking a more sympathetic view on the conflict, right? That person will look at them askance in the next faculty meeting. It doesn't need to be something as high level as someone might record it and it might go viral. It's, academics are as, sort of sensitive to social sort of norms and wanting to be liked as anybody else. And, if you've got colleagues who've really raised the stakes on this one particular issue and you're not sure how to feel about it, or you could pick another topic, it might just seem like, high risk and low reward. You might as well, pick a reading on another area of the world about water management and resources, for example.
Absolutely.
But the less moderates we have teaching about this and treating this as any other part of the world, the more voice the extremists have in what's shaping how young people see this. And when you look at that as a corollary to the kinds of things that they're seeing online, you find very quickly why even for students who don't have a great deal of knowledge, there is sort of an ambient sense that this is a place that is suspect at minimum, and that people who are sympathetic to it are as well.
Yeah, and there was a question about the question asked about what the audience member referred to as the perversion of what it means to be pro-Israel by so many, I think, more conservative organizations. That's, of course, editorializing, but I am curious because I think when we talk about like the inability to talk across lines of difference, perhaps on campus, one thing that's kind of interesting is if you go back to, I think it was 2010 that Students for Justice in Palestine really formally embraced this idea of anti-normalization, that we don't want to be in dialogue with anyone who disagrees with us for all the reasons we've heard. And that was around the same time that Hillel International introduced their Israel standards, which, there are differences between the two sides, but that basically said we're not going to partner, Hillels aren't allowed to partner with anti-Zionist groups on programming or events. And so, you mentioned, Vicky, I think about how a lot of Jewish students have these nuanced views. I mean, both of you said, right?
Yeah.
Critical of
Yes.
Israel, but still attached to Israel. But you see a lot less of that. We talk about like, oh, a lot of Jewish students, they criticize Israel, but they have family there and this and that. We see a lot less of that from the Jewish organizations that sort of represent Jewish students on campus in various ways. I mean, Hillel International doesn't, it's not a big Israel advocacy organization necessarily, but they don't criticize Israel. So how much are we seeing kind of an impact? Like, how much are the national Jewish organizations shaping people's perception of Jewish students themselves? And then if I can shoehorn a second half onto that, because Graham, you had mentioned this too, about ineffective interventions in campus anti-Semitism. So what are you seeing that's sort of not working? So whoever wants to take which part of that first.
Well, I'll say one thing. I mean, I think that often, people say students who are committed to Israel, but they criticize it. I think it's, for a lot of American Jews, it's committed to Israel and they criticize it, right?
Yes.
In the same way that committed Americans have critiques about how this country could be better. The same is true for people who are committed to the long-term vitality and democratic well-being of Israel as a country. Those things are not in conflict with each other. Being deeply committed means also feeling, sort of deeply frustrated that something you're committed to is not behaving better than you wish it was, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is more. I think a lot of the Jewish students and faculty, and I think this bears out in studies well beyond ours, they don't feel like they necessarily can have those more nuanced conversations easily outside of the family, so to speak, because they don't want to be perceived as sort of signing on to the critiques of Israel that don't have that sense of commitment to it, right? They don't want to find themselves sort of speaking in a way that makes people who are committed to the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, sort of nod their heads. I've heard talks by folks who work with large Jewish organizations on campus, like Hillel, say that part of their problem is that if they host certain kinds of programming, that they will have large donors who are more conservative walk away. And when they say to Jews who are further to the left, who have deep pockets, that would you replace that funding if we lost it? They don't get a lot of people coming forward, and at the end of the day, they need money to keep the doors open. And so you have to think about how your donors will respond. And there's more support coming from center right Jewish philanthropists than there are from center left to these campus organizations, which is unfortunate because the rigorous debate amongst Jewish students and their friends on campus, it would be wonderful to see Jewish campus organizations be able to take a more sort of balanced role in modeling that for the campus more broadly, not just on these issues, but because campuses so desperately need more spaces where students of different political persuasions and opinions actually engage each other rather than avoid each other or yell at each other either online or across a quad.
Right. It's
Yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, Graham will go to you in just one second, but it's sort of an interesting distortion of and this is a whole separate conversation about sort of Jewish philanthropy, but like if you just look at, say AIPAC and J Street, whatever you think of those two organizations, there's a huge disparity in resources that doesn't map onto like a public opinion poll of American Jews, because of course the fact that 60% of Jews feel one way doesn't mean that 60% of Jews are all donating the exact same amount of money as the other 40%.
Right.
So anyway, yeah, Graham, feel free to elaborate on that or talk about other ineffective interventions that
Yeah.
you've encountered.
Well, just to echo what Vicky said, so we've done research on this about how Jews think about Israel, and what we found is, so most Jews identify as liberal, and basically liberal Jews think about Israel similar to how liberal Americans think about America. That for liberal Americans, criticism of America is a form of patriotism. They criticize America because they love it and want to make it better, and that's exactly exactly how liberal Jews think about their relationship to Israel. Criticism is a marker of how they care about it. And so it makes sense that, and that's the bind that they find themselves in, that they feel that a lot of liberal Jews on campus who feel that way, don't feel that they have a place to express both of those views, both their criticism and their concern. And we have in some of our interviews, we've some of those Jewish students have told us that they don't feel welcome in any, either in the beekeeping club or the gardening club, but they don't necessarily feel welcome in the Jewish organizations either, because they do have deep criticism of some of Israel's actions, but they don't want to deny their care about Israel either, and that they find it's hard to find a place for someone like that on campus. And one of the things that students have said is sometimes when activist groups from outside the campus come to campus to try to protest anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, it does end up further inflaming tensions, and often putting a target on the back of the Jewish students, because they're, insofar as other students think that this organization is doing something bad, it's doing something bad to help the Jews. And one thing to be concerned about is if people think the same thing about what the federal government is doing. As I said, one of the conspiracy theories about an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is Jews secretly run the world and will punish anyone who works against them. And if you were slightly inclined to that view, and then you woke up and saw that some of your colleagues had been fired or lost funding because of what someone on your campus had said about Israel or Jews, that might cause you to think, hey, maybe there's something to this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Maybe the Jews really are running everything. And so this is, it's a tough issue, and trying to just wanting to fix the problem doesn't necessarily make it better. You need to act with care.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what an uplifting note to end on, but I guess it is in keeping with this conversation. But I think we covered a lot of really interesting ground. I know I learned a lot and got some new things to think about. So I think we're gonna leave it there for the Q&A. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the audience questions, although feel free. I don't know if we send out emails, but my email's online. You're welcome to reach out to me, or presumably to the panelists if you have
Sure.
emails on your websites. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and I'll turn it back to Jenny.
Vicki, Graham, and Arno, thank you for sharing your research and perspectives on anti-Semitism. You've been very generous with your time. This is a much bigger topic and warrants more conversation. We hope you'll return to the Network for Responsible Public Policy to continue the discussion in the future. In the next few days, this program will be available as a video on our website, nfrpp.org, as well as our YouTube channel to share with your friends on social media or in your classroom. Please sign up for our newsletter to learn about upcoming programs. Finally, as always, we value our audience's opinions. Please be on the lookout for an email from NFRPP with a brief audience survey. Your comments help us shape future programs. Thank you all for joining us. Good night, everybody.